Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you. My name is Richard Orme, and I'm your host for today's webinar, The Art and Science of Describing Images, Part 3. Okay, let's get started. Whether we're creating accessible documents or web content, adapted learning materials or examinations, we need to know about describing images. And many of the people attending our webinars are experienced in these tasks, but there's always more to learn. In the first webinar on this topic, The Art and Science of Describing Images, our presenters introduced 4 golden editing tips to help you craft effective descriptions, and they brought these to life by exploring examples of popular image types, from Shakespeare to pancakes via Freddie Mercury. Our second webinar, titled The Art and Science of Describing Images Part 2, covered techniques for complex images, tables and charts, infographics and maps. And if you missed it, then the videos, transcripts and slide decks are available on the DAISY website. Having covered the principles of basic and complex image types in the previous webinars, we're now ready to dive into even more challenging content. This webinar will cover topics requested by attendees in the previous sessions, including artwork, anatomy, and assessment. And indeed, I remember the question coming up, how do you describe test and examination materials without providing the answers? Well, hopefully our presenters will provide us with plenty of answers. So I'm going to get us started and hand over to our panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Valerie Morrison and I am the eText manager at CIDI at Georgia Tech, and that stands for the Center for Inclusive Design and Innovation, and we try and help post-secondary students to transform print textbooks and course materials into various accessible file formats.
Great, thanks Valerie. And my name's Hugh Alexander. I'm Managing Director of Textbox. We focus on providing image description work and projects for the publishing industry. So at the beginning of last session 2 of the Art and Science of Describing Images, I made a comment that I'll probably kind of live to regret, in terms of thinking that second part was the Empire Strikes Back of image description. Well, the saga continues today. We are moving on to the Return of the Jedi, the third part of the trilogy of our image description talks. This is the bit where we kind of start off in carbonite, kind of stuck to a wall, and things are not looking rosy. It's all a bit complicated. But hopefully by the end of it, it will get less complicated, and you'll have some guidelines and ideas for how to move forward with working with complex images and describing complex images for your titles, and in assessment as well. So that'll be a new kind of topic we covered today, is working with test and assessment. So the 3 kind of sections for today are artwork, as Richard has said, artwork, anatomy, which can be a bit of a tricky one with anatomy textbooks, very complicated diagrams within those, and then finally we'll deal with assessment. And as Richard said, at the end of each section we will deal with any questions that may come up, and you can add them through the Q&A option on Zoom. So without further ado, part 1, artwork. I will hand back over to Valerie to talk about Botticelli.
Great, thank you, Hugh. So in this slide, I've chosen one of my favorite paintings of all time. It is Primavera by Sandro Botticelli. And I chose it, 1, because I love it, and 2, because it's one of the most written about pieces of art in all of art history. There are dissertations, books, documentaries, and you could go on and on and on about this painting if you were going to try and write alt text description. So I have written a very brief description of the painting over to the left, which I'll read aloud. Botticelli's tempera painting Primavera from the late 1470s, is currently on display in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. The painting was commissioned for a marriage within the Medici family, and the mythological figures in this garden scene serve as an allegory for springtime and marriage. So that is, as you can imagine, a very overview look at what the painting contains. I haven't talked at all about color, composition, the figures. I haven't named the figures. I really didn't get in depth, but that would be my first take at a brief description. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've listed some other elements you might want to think about if you are creating a more comprehensive alt text description. I would consider some of the following elements of a painting or a work of art before you begin writing, because if you just start writing and you could just get lost and keep going and there's no organization or structure. So for any piece of art or complex image that you're describing, I would always start off with that brief description, right? An overview that provides the framework for the listener. And then you could consider some of these ideas to provide further details, such as the artist's style, color and composition, the stylization of the figures, the allegorical meaning of these different figures, right? The wind is touching the nymph who is erupting flowers on Flora, and it's all ruled over by Venus and the Graces. So you could really kind of tease out that meaning if you wanted to. You could talk about the artist's influence or the historical context of the painting. If you wanted to do all of those in alt text description, I would say you've gone too far, and to pull back and try and think about the context in which your image appears. So what do you want your audience to get? What is the main point? Why are you including this image here at this time? And if you did want to cover all of those, I would say you would probably be better served by writing an extended description. And we've just been told that there is an upcoming webinar on extended description. So you'll be hearing a little bit more about that as we go forward. And next slide, please.
Great, thank you so much, Valerie. I just wanted to kind of follow up on Botticelli by talking about sector description. Now, I mentioned this in the previous session. It's a way of breaking down a complex image or a complex artwork into its kind of constituent parts. So if you think about the Botticelli, if we jump back here, there's a lot going on in that image. If you break it down into sections, you can actually describe it in a logical, organized way and kind of go on a journey through that image, which is immersive to the actual reader. So you're not just kind of saying, oh, these are the various things that are happening. It's actually, you can go through and describe each element of the image as you go across with all the different figures. Or for instance, you could use a clock face approach where you can say at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, this is what's happening in that image. Or as on the right hand side there, you've got a compass approach. So north, south, east and west, which can be used for kind of complex diagrams like maps. But for Botticelli, creating that kind of immersive experience, on the left hand side here, there's a kind of outline diagram of the Botticelli Primavera. And this is the segmentation approach. This is the actual approach that AI uses for identifying components in an image. So here you can see each of the figures is named, and you can go through and use that kind of approach to create that description. So you're ending up with a very immersive experience, including all the details. But one of the details I actually wanted to kind of mention was Botticelli was very, very important in botany. All of the flowers, there's over 150 flowers in this single painting. All of them are exactly correct and have been tested by botanists since then, and all of them still exist in Tuscany now. So that's another kind of context, going back to Valerie's mentioned it before in terms of context. You could be looking at this picture in terms of a kind of biology lecture rather than a kind of art history, in terms of the accuracy of Botticelli's descriptions and of the actual plants in it. So there's very many different ways you can come at kind of describing a complex image, but just wanted to have that, show that example as kind of one of the little details, because it's such a beautiful painting and there's so much going on, you can often forget the flowers in it, but having those details in it create that kind of immersive experience for the user, for the screen reader user. Secondly, in terms of painting, here's an example of using sector. So this is the Flemish Fair by Pieter Bruegel, which is an incredibly detailed painting. It's quite huge as well, and there's hundreds and hundreds of figures in here. So actually creating a description for this can be quite difficult. But if you use the sector approach, you can divide the painting into basically four quadrants, and then describe each quadrant. So you're actually creating kind of helping the spatial awareness of the user, so they can actually picture what's actually happening throughout that painting. You end up with each section being divided. Now, in the top corner here, there's a web link to arts and culture from Google. So that's artsandculture.google.com. Now, this is a fantastic resource for anyone who's dealing with art history or describing images. It hasn't got every image, but it's got a huge kind of array of images across history. And what Google have done is gone in and scanned very detailed, great detail, some wonderful images, and the Botticelli's on there, quite a few of his on there from before, but also this one from Bruegel. But you can go into so much detail that you can actually see the paint strokes. And it's a wonderful way of working with detailed, complex images like this, or complex paintings like this one. So you can really see what's actually happening in the image. So in this one, we've focused in on the upper left-hand quadrant, and we can see a lot of things happening around this kind of church building. You end up with the alt text description being an oil painting by Pieter Bruegel the Younger, entitled A Village Festival in honour of St. Hubert and St. Anthony. The painting is dated to between 1616 and 1635. The scene is one of mass revelry along the main thoroughfare of a village in celebration of the religious festival of the Saints Anthony and Hubert. The street is filled with revellers and events. Bruegel has contrasted the indulgence and misbehaviour of some of the villagers with moments of happiness and care from others. The scene is very detailed and is divided into four quadrants to aid the visualisation of the scene. So basically, you're setting up the scene. You're providing an overview, some details of what's actually the user can expect, and then explaining that you'll go through the description in four quadrants and explain each section as you go. So the upper right quadrant, this is actually the upper left quadrant, sorry. Oh no, it is the upper right quadrant, sorry. The section includes the following 10 events, and then you talk about a goat grazes in the grounds of the church, a woman holds a small child by the hand as they walk into the church, etc., etc. But you get all that detail that Bruegel was conveying in the image. So a group of men lean on the church wall and they're deep in conversation, and three men are leaning on a table and seem to be playing a game of chance. So you actually get all of that detail in an organised way. So you're basically just listing out what's actually happening. And sector is just a way of structuring, creating that framework to enable you to do that. Otherwise, you can go into these kind of complicated images and think, where do I actually start? So you start with that overview, and then you go through to the detail afterwards, and you can use lists to do that. This full description for this ends up being kind of 2 pages, so you can see how much work has gone into it from Bruegel, and how much work needs to be done to describe in full. And of course it does depend on the context. So if you're doing an art history course, you'd want all that detail, but sometimes you'd want less detail, and perhaps the kind of alt text would be enough for the user. Any questions so far on talking about artwork in particular? No, we're all quiet.
Okay, so I'll just pick one question that I have here, which is
Go on.
that for the examples used in this presentation so far, we've seen the images on their own. And Kathy is saying the images that they describe are included in a book. So what advice do you have for considering the surrounding text when deciding on the image description?
That's a really important question, and as Valerie was talking before, with context, it is all about context. So you could be with the Botticelli, for instance, as I said, you could be having that image in a textbook, an art history textbook, or you could have it in a biology textbook if you need it. So it really does depend on the context around it, what kind of approach you use. So you'll generally always need an alt text. In some kind of form, whether the most drastic kind of option would be if it's just a decorative image. We're not probably, if it's a complex image, it's not going to be that decorative. But if you're only just briefly mentioning, oh, here's a painting from Botticelli, you might not necessarily need the full description. Also, if you take a look at the text and the author is described in detail, there's been a whole chapter on Botticelli's Primavera, and explained it in detail. You might not necessarily need a full complete description, but you might just need, like Valerie provided before, a kind of briefer description. So it really does depend on the context and how that image is used, in terms of whether it is used in art history or it is used as a kind of a botany example for flora of Tuscany or something. But yes, the context is critical. So you always need to read around the image to make sure that that you're not repeating yourself, because the last thing you want to do is say the person's read the whole page of text and now they're going to read a whole page of alt text as well, which pretty much says the same thing. You don't want that duplication.
Right.
Right,
Great.
I agree. I would also like to add to that my favorite thing to see when we are converting textbooks is a book where the author or the publisher has provided wonderful full captions, because then we can do less work and less heavy lifting in writing our alt text descriptions. And if you are creating the material yourself, if you are an author or a faculty, and you're creating educational materials or any kind of materials, I would say, captions are wonderful resources for sighted individuals as well, for people who are not using assistive technology. Everyone then has the benefit of understanding why that image was included, what the relevant details are, its importance, its context, and then the alt text can be much more brief.
Valerie, thank you for that. We have more questions, but we'll keep them over until the end. We'll just remind our presenters this is being live captioned, and so please be careful not to speak too quickly and allow our captions as far as possible to be in sync with the slides. So please watch your speaking rate.
No
Okay,
problem.
great.
That'll be my South London accent. Sorry.
Okay, so let's move on. Please, let's proceed.
One thing, and just to go back to that, captioning is fantastic. Captioning is really does make a difference. Also saves publishers money because you don't have to create all the alt text. But one of the examples I have seen is some publishers do tend to put the source of the image, say Getty Images, and just have that as the caption. That's not terribly useful. The source can be included within a caption, but don't just have the source, because it doesn't really tell you that much, because generally it's kind of copyright Getty Images, and that's not explaining too much to the user. So anyway,
great. That was artwork. What's next?
Anatomy, part 2. Back to you, Valerie, deciding what to include.
Okay, thank you. So I have chosen an image here. It's a 2-part anatomy and physiology image of the anterior view of the skull. And there is a lot of visual information in these 2 images. And so one of the pitfalls of describing complex anatomy and physiology diagrams is to just label all the parts and be done with it, right? So if I were to see this or be training someone on how to write alt text for this image, I would expect to see someone writing 2 skulls, or maybe they even specify 2 human skulls with the following labeled parts, and then a list of all of those different bones and structures. But that is leaving out a lot of visual information. So I've listed here some different things to think about to add to your alt text to make it more comprehensive. So instead of just labeling the parts, think about not only the names of the structures, but their appearance or shape, the location of each bone on the skull, or the proximity to other structures on the skull. And like Hugh was talking about with the quadrant or sector approach, you could you could divide the skull from top to bottom and describe the top of the skull features and how they're shaped, that sort of thing. So when you are describing these images, think about your context and think about what you want the individual or student to learn and retain in terms of visual information. Next slide, please. So again, you don't want to just rely on labels only. So here's another example of a diagram of the veins of the upper arm going from the clavicle down the arm to the fingertips. And it's color coded to specify which are the deep veins and which are superficial veins. And again, the description that I've shown here is again just relying on labels only. So I described it as a diagram showing an anterior view of the veins of the clavicle and arm. There are deep veins and superficial veins. The deep veins are as follows, and then I just listed all of the labels on that diagram. So that's great. That's a good basic alt text description of that image. However, what's missing are the spatial relations of these veins to one another, the relative size of each vein, where in the body these veins occur, how they are all connected. You really don't get a sense of the networking and the branching of the veins. So when you are writing descriptions of anatomy and physiology, you want to pay attention to the labels, but also think a little bit more of the visual impact of the diagram. What else could you include that would give educational information to the person listening? And then I'm going to hand it back to you, Hugh.
Great, thanks, Valerie. So continuing on the theme, so we're talking about dividing and conquering. So we've got an image of the upper respiratory tract on the screen here, and this is another thing that you could use with the sector kind of approach, in terms of you kind of looking at it from to being a journey basically from the mouth and the nasal cavity all the way through down to the lungs and the diaphragm. So you can segment it all the way down the respiratory canal and describe each area in turn. So you end up with something would look a little bit like this. So you have your alt text up front. So a diagram illustrates the main components of the human respiratory system. And then you have your long description or your extended description, which goes into the detail. So it's a line drawing of the torso and head of a human. The head is turned and faces to the right. The organs of the respiratory system are viewed in cross-section. The respiratory tract is divided into upper and lower sections. So basically you're creating that structural description so that the user can understand, oh, this is exactly kind of an overview of what we're seeing, and it's going to be, the description is going to be divided into upper and lower sections as follows. So then you describe through the upper respiratory tract with a list again, and then the lower respiratory tract again with a list. So you go through the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the epiglottis, the larynx, basically following that journey all the way through the body, going through down to the trachea, the bronchi, the lung, the bronchioles, the alveolus, then the esophagus, and finishing up with the diaphragm. And then you're providing details as you go along. So with the nasal cavity, you're saying the nasal cavity is a large air-filled space above and behind the nose. So you're giving that structural description again. You're saying this is the area we're talking about, and then you're saying a description of what it looks like and where it is. So you're positioning each element within the diagram. And that's really important for kind of understanding, again, that immersive experience of saying, being able to visualize. What you're trying to do is ensure that the user can visualize what they're seeing. One thing that always occurs to me, anatomy is very tricky in terms of description, because it's natural, and often it's describing things in ways that are kind of, it's difficult to describe shapes because they're not, everything isn't in the body isn't round or perfectly kind of circles or squares or triangles or anything like that. So it's worth thinking about describing in natural description ways, in terms of using other elements of nature to describe the elements of the anatomy. So here we've got the epiglottis is a leaf-shaped structure, or nuts are quite good as well, kind of almond-shaped, or hazelnuts, or things like that. They actually are quite useful in being able, in helping people to visualize what that actually looks like. So always think about tubes and structures like that in terms of, or branch-like structures, especially with the lungs. Using natural descriptions to describe anatomy is quite helpful, because people can picture that in an easier way, rather than just saying, oh, it's kind of oval shaped, which is, you know, a little bit vague. The second image here is a diagram illustrating the anatomy of the human eye. Again, it's going to be that journey. So the eye is viewed in cross section, so you're providing that structural element up front. The eye can be divided into two segments, the anterior and the posterior. The components of the two segments are as follows. So the anterior segment, again, you're using that kind of list structure to organize the description. It's the anterior segment representing the front third of the eye, and then you talk about the cornea, which is the outer layer of the eye, which is controlled by muscles. You have the pupil, which is the pupil is the aperture or hole in the center of the iris. Then you have the iris itself. The iris surrounds the pupil. And then you have the lens, and the lens is an ellipsoid structure that sits behind the pupil and iris and refracts light into the retina, and muscles control the adjustment of the lens. And then you have the posterior segment, which has a cavity, the retina, the fovea. And then you talk about the optic nerve running from the back of the eye to the brain. And the diagram illustrates how the retina interprets an image as upside down and backwards. So in the example, a leaf is used to illustrate this concept. So basically, it kind of explains how whenever you're seeing something, it translates it to the brain as upside down and backwards. So that probably explains why I was no good at anatomy, because I had everything upside down and backwards. So basically what we're doing is stepping through the image and describing it bit by bit, and helping the user really keep their place, so they know they're on a journey through that description, and they can jump backwards and forwards if it's as part of a long or extended description. Don't put all this information into an alt text, because the screen reader will just read the whole thing in one go, and it can be quite confusing. But if you've got this much information in an extended description, then the user can jump backwards and forwards and really kind of visualize where they are in that diagram. Any questions for anatomy?
Specifically on anatomy, Hugh and Valerie, we have the question, is it advised to use a dictionary for descriptions or when describing anatomy parts?
In terms of describing, using that kind of dictionary description of the elements within that anatomy, absolutely. I couldn't do it. I'm not a doctor or anything like that. I haven't had medical training. I find it fascinating though to do kind of anatomy, because you do learn a lot about yourself, for want of a better word. but definitely it's worth using a dictionary just for accuracy, and not just a dictionary. Wikipedia is a fantastic resource, I must admit.
I wonder, Hugh, and I'll come to you, Valerie, whether the question was actually also thinking about there's some technical terms that you've used indeed in the description. So
Yeah.
do they need to be explained, or is it about just staying in the same kind of level of technicality as the surrounding text? Valerie, what's your approach to this?
Well, I would say I agree with you. I am often Googling, Wikipediaing, if that's a word, to check and make sure and refer, make sure I'm using the correct terms. Sometimes I even need to do a reverse Google image search to figure out what an image is if the textbook has not provided any context or caption for me. So I'm often referring out to those sources, but then I'm careful not to just copy and paste what I find and use that as my description. Because the student or individual taking a class or using the material, they can always go out and Google those terms themselves. So I'm just using it to kind of inform me of what I need to focus on and using it for reference. And then
Right.
I'm trying not to um, redefine all of the terms, and because then you never stop writing at that point.
Okay, sure. Okay, I hope that answered your question, Nada. If it didn't, then feel free to post a supplementary question. But I think for the purpose of time, let's press on. And so we have some time for wrap-up questions towards the end. So I'm storing some up.
Great.
Thanks, Richard. Part 3, assessment. Over to you, Valerie.
Okay, thank you. I am starting here with an image that has silhouettes of many different countries, and have to admit I cannot recognize any of them. My geography is not that great. I haven't really studied them, but this would be very difficult for me as a sighted individual as an exam. But this is an example of a test question, hopefully in a geography class. And the question was to identify each country by its silhouette. And when you are testing and using visuals in order to test learning or education goals, think not in terms of absolute equality, but think in terms of being egalitarian instead, right? So not every test question or image that you provide is going to work for every person or every student. So in a testing environment, you want to think about alternative ways to assess someone's knowledge. So I've listed some possible alternative test questions. Instead of being able to identify a country by its silhouette, maybe you could instead ask someone to answer questions about the size or location of a country, or ask in a question in essay format, where you have essay questions about a country's imports or exports or its location or proximity to other countries. Sort of again, hearkening back to Hugh's sector approach, right? You could talk more about the country and what it borders, what countries are adjacent to it. That might be a little bit more egalitarian in terms of you're not asking someone to identify a shape. And then finally, another way to approach this question, if you did really want that student or a person to learn the exact shape of a country, then you would need to think about providing that information in tactile graphic form, or creating a thermoform where you are tracing the shape or creating the shape out of different materials and then vacuum sealing it. If you're not familiar with the thermoform, it's often used and incorporated in Braille. So you are creating a raised or embossed shape for someone to trace their fingers so they could recognize the shape. Just speaking from my perspective as someone who does not have any print-related or visual disabilities, this would be very difficult for me. Not everyone has the capacity to retain visual images. So I would think about possible other ways of assessing people's knowledge about country shapes. All right, next slide, please. All right, I'm back on my skull theme. So to return to the human skull, here is a test question where it says, check your understanding, label the following figures. And then we have a diagram of a human skull with different color-coded regions. Some of the structures have been labeled, but there are many, many blanks for the student to fill in. Some alternative assessment opportunities for this kind of question where you're asked to see something and provide labels for what you see. If someone cannot do that, then there are some alternative assessment strategies. So you could use Hugh's example or his method of sector analysis and list the bones of the skull from top to bottom, or left to right, or clockwise, or by region, or by quadrant. So those are all opportunities for the student to demonstrate their knowledge of the location or arrangement of the different features of the skull without having to use a visual diagram. Another opportunity would be to say, match each bone or structure on the skull to its description or function. So then you have an opportunity for students to interact just with text, right? They can hear the word of the bone or structure read aloud and then locate its meaning or definition or structure or description and match it up. Another way of assessing this information would be to provide essay format questions about the different skull structures. Maybe you could ask a question where the student could respond and describe all of the bones and structures around the eye orbit, right? And then they can go in depth and detail about those structures and bones, describe where they are, how they function, and then the student is not having to, again, reference a visual diagram. And then finally, again, if you did really want someone to be able to physically manipulate a tactile graphic or thermoform, or if you had a skeleton model for classroom use, you could use that in your assessment as well. And I am going to pass it on over to Hugh.
Thanks, Valerie. I was just looking at those silhouettes of countries, and I couldn't think of any of them. It was really impossible. And I could see all 30 of them. One of them actually just looked like Godzilla's head, and I'm not sure that that's the correct answer. Anyway, next slide is a chemical romance. So talking a little bit about chemistry. So there on the left-hand side, there is a molecular structure of sophrose, a saccharide found in certain types of beans. It has the structure shown in figure 1. And on the next slide, there's three questions, three multiple choice questions related to this image. So we've done a description of this in terms of the molecular structure of sophrose, which is 2 monosaccharides are joined by a glycosidic link. The structure is as follows. What we're trying to do with the description is provide a really basic description of what is actually being shown, but not giving away the answer, because there's going to be 3 questions afterwards. So you have to be very careful and look at the answers as you write the description as well, so you don't give away too much. So we're saying that it's split into a monosaccharide 1. So carbon 1 is single bonded to 1 hydrogen and 1 OH group. So basically you're retelling what's actually in the image. You're not actually saying what OH is again, so you're making the user think and for themselves and describe or kind of see the screen reader user is getting exactly the same information as the sighted user. That's the main thing to think about. And then you go through each element, so carbon-2, single bond into hydrogen and 1 oxygen, and going through each one, carbon-3, carbon-4, carbon-5, and then oxygen is at position 6. And then the oxygen at position 2 links to a single monosaccharide, and then you talk about the second monosaccharide molecule, and provide all the details through there. And then you go to the answers, or the question, sorry, on the next slide. So is sofrose a monosaccharide, disaccharide, or polysaccharide? You haven't given away the answer in the description. The user still needs to think it's 2 monosaccharides, so it's a disaccharide, I think. So part B, why are the monosaccharides in, what are the monosaccharides in sofrose? Sofrose consists of 1 fructose molecule and 1 glucose molecule. B is sofrose consists of 2 fructose molecules, or C, sofrose consists of 2 glucose molecules. Now, in the description, you haven't mentioned at all fructose or glucose, so the user has to know the answer, so you're not giving it away in the description. And then part C is what is the glycosidic link in sofrose. Included this one mainly because I think it's important to be careful about using symbols in descriptions and in questions. The answers here are alpha 1, beta 1, 2, alpha 2, or beta 1. C is beta 1, 2, which is the actual answer, and C is alpha 1, 4. So one of the things that when I was working on this, I kind of used an NVDA screen reader to look at kind of reading Greek icons or letters. Alpha's great, beta's great, delta doesn't get read out by NVDA, which is quite strange. I'm not quite sure why. So just be aware that including Greek letters in or symbols of any kind, it's always worth testing them before you actually include them, because it might be missing out the actual answer for the user, and that kind of puts them at a disadvantage.
Hugh, talking of being tested, we're being tested slightly with the time, so I'm just letting you know that we've got. Yeah.
No problem. This is the last slide, so we should be good. I just wanted to mention briefly about MathSpeak, which is a way of describing equations and mathematics in a kind of more verbose way, and enabling people to actually, a lot of equations are included in textbooks as an image if they're not used in MathML. So it's just an image. So you need to be able to provide a properly constructed equation which can be read out by a screen reader. So this is the Kessel Run, which is from Star Wars. It basically describes time dilation, moving through time and what happens. So with this equation, it becomes T prime baseline equals T over start root 1 minus start fraction V superscript 2 over C superscript 2 end fraction end root, which sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but it is actually a brilliant system for describing equations. I've included the link there to the grammar. There's pages and pages of grammar for how to actually write out equations and mathematics. It's really straightforward to learn, actually, and can make a real difference to the accessibility of your mathematics content. So definitely a shout out for MathSpeak if you're not using MathML. And that is bringing us to the end of the Return of the Jedi. The Death Star has blown up. The Millennium Falcon is flying happily to the planet of Endor to have a terrible party with Ewoks at the end of the trilogy. We hope that that's given you some kind of insights in how to kind of approach complex diagrams and images. I know it's quite brief. We've only got an hour. We could probably talk all day about complex images and the different things that people face when including complex diagrams in their textbooks and publishing content. But hopefully that will give you a good guideline to get started. And if you have any questions, now is the time.
Well, we do have some questions. Let's see how many we can fit in before we wrap up at the top of the hour. So the first, Hugh, would you be able to go back to the chemical romance slide? And on this slide, some commas were included in the suggested text. I see here on the first bullet point, you've got carbon 1 single bonded to 1 hydrogen and 1 O, H group. So the question is that a deliberate thing to somehow try and improve the user experience for someone who's listening through speech, or is that just an artifact of the slide? And indeed, what is that approach around using, you talked about it a little bit of checking how it sounds with a screen reader. What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
basically, that's a kind of personal approach from testing descriptions with a screen reader, and just creating pauses. Screen readers can be a bit temperamental with punctuation. So I tend to be really strict on the type of punctuation I use. Like I would never use a semicolon. I tend to avoid colons, things like that. Commas are your friend. They do create a small pause. So the worry with writing OH, which is, as you can see, is in the actual image, and is the chemical term for it, it does create the possibility with some screen readers that they read it out as O, as in oh no, and that creates problems because that's incorrect. Because you hear that and go it must be just oxygen. So it's trying to create a way of making things, especially with equations and molecular structures like this, making them more accurate and making it as accurate as possible. So strategic commas create pauses going through. So you've got C, comma, you just have that moment of pause for the screen reader, and then H2, comma, and then OH. So it's just a way of splitting things out and making it hopefully more easier to digest for the reader.
Yeah, and Dave points out that on that OH example, some screen readers might even, or maybe it's the voice, might expand it to a high O, for example.
Oh
And
yes,
yet,
yeah.
and yet Dina, it's not his question specifically, but Dina is kind of interested in the use of the alt text by Braille. So what you've done is introduced a comma onto someone who's reading with a Braille display. Valerie, your thoughts on this?
So I agree. Yes, that's a great example with the O because it would pitch up in JAWS and it would be reading the sentence and say to 1 hydrogen and 1 O group. It's a little alarming. And so we usually use spaces, and especially not only with chemistry and math speak, but when we are including acronyms. So if we were putting USA, we would either type it all out, United States of America, or we would put capital U space, capital S space, capital A. I think in terms of regular alt text, I don't have any comments because I'm not as familiar with converting into Braille. But in terms of regular alt space, this or alt text, everything on this slide is it would be read correctly. We just use a space instead of a comma. But the end goal is to create that pause in the reading that Hugh and I are often testing with these screen readers to make sure the user experience is accurate.
Thank you both. So this doesn't relate specifically to anatomy. There's actually been quite a bit of traffic on this while you've been presenting, which is, golly, the descriptions that are being given are so much longer than people are used to. And we've heard this before. People, to their understanding, have been told that there was a limit to alt text of 125 characters or whatever. So I think it's good to just go over again. We've some of these descriptions go on. We've got bullet points and all sorts of bits and bobs in there. What is this business about? A limit to alt text, and what you've referred to on this slide that you've just brought up, Hugh, a long description or extended description. Could you help us with that?
Sure. So yes, it can be quite confusing because alt text it can be used as a kind of all-encompassing umbrella term for alt text, but there are kind of levels of alt text, as it were. So alt text is really the brief description that you're going to provide, which is going to go in the alt tag in the book alongside the image. So that's going to be brief. So that's what people are thinking about in terms of it needs to be short. So 1 or 2 sentences. There's lots of schools of thought, 140 characters, 125 characters, but basically it's going to be pretty short. You're going to be using 20 words or so at the most to just kind of have an overview. It's an introduction that tells the reader what they're actually looking at. If they want more information, then it needs to be included in a long description. What you can't do with alt text is include things like bullet points. It doesn't do very well with kind of complicated punctuation. It's pretty basic. So think of that as your basic introduction, and then with a long description or an extended description, you're providing the full detail. You would never put all of this information into an alt text. There are issues about whether the screen reader will read it all, or sometimes they'll cut it off potentially after a certain amount of words. So have an alt text that's brief and then a long description that can be passed through at leisure by the screen reader user. The long description, as Valerie mentioned before, that is going to be dealt with in another DAISY webinar in 2 weeks' time about how to include long descriptions in EPUB. There are various methods of doing that, which are pretty cool and kind of really enable publishers to provide a great experience for their users in terms of providing all the information. So you can imagine trying to describe the complex structure of the eye or the respiratory tract in an alt text. It's really going to be quite basic. You can't provide the detail that's necessary, but with a long description you can.
Great, thank you. So don't steal my thunder, but I'm going to see if we can squeeze in just a couple of questions relating to art. We didn't have time for them earlier. So the first is your thoughts on describing aspects such as atmosphere, colors, and perspective. Thinking of these might be concepts that are not familiar to someone who was congenitally blind, for example. So that could be a webinar in itself, maybe, but also maybe a more specific question, which is concerning artworks. If you have a really precise caption, would it be an option to copy this simply into the alt text and make that be the alt text as well?
Well, I would say, oh, go ahead.
Go for it, Valerie.
I would say you never want to repeat verbatim what the caption says, because the caption will usually be read directly before or after the alt text is pronounced. So you're really just kind of annoying the person listening to the alt text description by forcing them to hear it over again. So usually we try and conceive of the alt text as filling in the blanks. So if the information on the page and the caption don't cover something, that's what we're using our alt text description to provide that extra information, that extra important, relevant information.
And briefly, Valerie, any thoughts on these? Could I call them cited concepts? How have you kind of approached that in the past at CIDI?
Well, I have a very strange story about that. So we have incorporated when we are training student workers or new staff to the eText team, we are usually giving them images that then they describe for us as a part of a computer skills and writing test. And we used to have, one of the images was a recycling bin, the bright orange recycling bin with the recycling logo or symbol on the front. And the person describing it, bless his heart, really was trying and giving his all. He described the recycling bin and said what it was, the color, the logo, and then he really thought about it, that someone might not know what the shape of a recycling bin is. And he started trying to describe the shape and the interior space of the recycling bin, and things got weird very quickly. Um, he started writing about how you put your hands inside the bin and go down and around the curves. Things got strangely sensual. It was uncomfortable for everyone to read. And so I think we learned from that. And I use it as a kind of a humorous example that um, we can't really define the world for someone. We have to describe the shape as best we can, and then and the color as best we can, and everyone sees those colors differently. So trying to describe a color is kind of an ephemeral pursuit anyway. So
Right.
we try and stop short of kind of world building, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks for that. Hugh, could you take us to the closing slide, please? Okay, we're coming to the end of this session. Thank you to Valerie and Hugh once again for your great information and insights. So the previous webinars are all available on the DAISY website, so do head there to check out the back catalogue. It really is a treasure trove of resources. And our next webinar will be on February the 24th, and it's titled Implementing Extended Descriptions in Digital Publications, Best Practices and Practical Advice. So previous webinars have discussed in detail the methodology for describing images, and this next webinar is focused on the step of implementing those extended descriptions in digital publications. So using real-world examples, the webinar will walk through practical methods for adding extended descriptions to publications, highlighting best practices, discussing the implications for assistive technology users, and offering insights into how publishers are implementing this essential accessibility feature. Find out more at daisy.org/webinars, where you can also sign up to the webinar announcements mailing list. I hope you'll join us again soon. In the meantime, thank you for your time, stay safe and well, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.